Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello and welcome to Self-Improvement Atlas, the personal science insight podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Aditi Kuti. Let's get on with the show. Welcome back to Self-Improvement Atlas. Today, we are going to talk about personality assessments, all the different personality assessments that are available, how accurate are they, how do they compare with each other? And to chat with me about that today, I'm here with Clinical Associate Professor Niel Jeyasingam, who is a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and psychodynamic psychotherapy supervisor at the University of Sydney. Professor Jeyasingam, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I've given you a brief introduction, but do you mind, for the benefit of our audience, just telling us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Certainly. So I'm a former research scholar of the Institute of Psychiatry in Sydney and the Institute of Psychiatry in the UK. I completed my medical degree and my psych training in Sydney, completed advanced training in the Maudsley in London. I hold a double master's in psychiatry and in business and health administration. And I have about 50 publications in phenomenology, personality disorders, psychotherapy, generally things beginning with P. In public practice, I'm the area clinical director for mental health services in a regional center. I'm a Foundation Accredited Member of the Royal Australian and New Zealand Psychotherapy faculty, clinical associate professor with Sydney University, former chair of the Faculty of Old Age Psychiatry. I became interested in personality from a very early stage in my training as a registrar and working with people, particularly with personality disorders, and completed my master's thesis on personality disorders in older adults, which has been referenced for the DSM-5 in terms of evaluation of the applicability of personality disorders therein. And find it a fascinating and complicated area that has changed remarkably in the last 20 years and continues to change. And very happy to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like with all of those qualifications under your belt, we found the right person to chat to. The DSM-5, from what I understand, has only been around about 2 decades or just a bit more than. So I assume since that's come out, a lot of things have had to change in how we view personality and how we do mental health disorders in general, but especially personality disorders.
That's correct, and it's also not correct because there has been. We've had an idea of what personality is for centuries, if not more, particularly coming from the ancient Greeks, talking about people with sanguine, choleric, and melancholic personalities. And from high school English studies on Shakespeare, most of us cut our teeth on personality assessments by trying to work out why Hamlet doesn't bother to do anything until the final act. But when it comes to things like personality disorders and how we actually define a personality, there's been some individual personality disorders which really haven't changed very much. My favorite thing about the DSM-5 is behind the scenes, there were so many arguments between the practitioners who were designing DSM-5 in terms of updating the personality disorders from DSM-4 through to DSM-5. I mean, they actually had some great ideas. They had the idea of creating dimensional variables and trying to bring it back towards a more psychodynamic interpretation of the different personality factors. After more than a year of debate, they gave up. And the entire DSM-5 personality disorder chapter is identical to DSM-4, but all of their debates and arguments they put into section 3 as the for further research / argument section of the DSM-5. So yes, a lot has changed and a lot hasn't.
Wow, I love the idea that it just after almost a year of debating, they kind of just had enough of the discussion and tabled it for another time.
I know a lot of academics. I know a lot of psychiatrists. They're very good at arguing. You get a bunch of
Yeah.
academic psychiatrists. That's a whole new world.
Absolutely. Well, I'm excited to see it one day. Hopefully, I'll be present in the room when one of these debates are happening. But I think before we kind of get into talking about that in a bit more detail, we've got a section called "Have You Met Dr. Niel Jeyasingam?" in which I ask you a couple of questions and there's no wrong answers. They're all about yourself. All you have to do is answer them. Are you happy to go through that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Fantastic. So what is your favorite book?
That would have to be Momo by Michael Ende,
Okay.
a fascinating text from the 1980s, a children's book that is actually a parable for modern society wrapped up in clinical reasoning.
Fantastic. That's I haven't read that book myself, but that's another one to add to the book list. What about a movie? Do you have a favorite movie?
That would probably have to be King of Kings. The visual depiction of the life and crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Christian films vary a huge amount in their quality. This one I particularly like because it's quite sensitive and not overblown, but deals with the story in a manner as respectful, but also as accurate as reasonably can be put.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Do you have a podcast that you've been listening to lately?
Apart from this one, no, not yet. I'm a bit late to the podcast game.
Right.
I understand that there's this entire technology called the internet, which has turned up reasonably while I was writing. So yes, one of the things that I'm grateful for speaking today is to get used to the idea that there is this whole world of information that I haven't really noticed.
Yeah, I sometimes podcasts are not everyone's thing because sitting down and listening to something is with nothing else to do could be a bit. It's not really for everyone, so I do understand it. But I'm glad that you listened to this one at the very least. What about a famous role model? Did you have one growing up or currently?
That would have to be, it's split between Michael Ende, who wrote Momo, and who, by the way, wrote The Never-Ending Story, which you might be more familiar
Yeah.
with, as well as the late, great Sir Terry Pratchett, remarkable fantasy novelist from England and author of, I think, one of the greatest humanistic science fantasy books of all time.
Yeah, Terry Pratchett is such a wonderful author, and it's a shame that he left us so early. I think so much more I'm sure there was to give from him. What about the last course that you completed?
The last one that I did was which was that? That was an update regarding transcranial magnetic stimulation. I do a fair bit of in addition to psychotherapy, I do a fair bit of stimulation-related work in electroconvulsive therapy in particular. Transcranial magnetic stimulation I find quite fascinating because it has actually been around for decades, but there has been a lot of progress in its applicability and indications more recently. So yeah, that would have been my last one.
At the risk of derailing this entire show, what is transmagnetic? Is it cranial stimulation? Am I getting it right?
So transcranial magnetic stimulation actually came about when some individuals discovered that their depression was getting better after they had multiple MRIs. And it's the issue that applying a rapidly alternating magnetic field was associated with improving mental health, specifically depression. And it doesn't involve anesthetic. The problem for ages has been extremely low success rate of about 20 to 30%. More recently, this has gone up to roughly 40 to 50%, and it is not as good as electroconvulsive therapy, but it looks like it may be as good as antidepressants or even better, and is potentially the next phase of mental health treatments.
that is really fascinating as someone who's personally dealt with depression in the past and has dealt with it chronically. That's really fascinating to me. And I wish I want to bring you back on another show just so we can talk about that, because that sounds really fascinating. I'd love to know more. But our show today is about personality assessments and how various personality assessments compare. So we might kind of hone in on that. Starting really broadly, our show is about personal development. So I wanted to ask you, how do you define personal development?
So I think the Greeks again got it right with eudaimonia as an older word which is so old that no one exactly knows what it means, but roughly translates as flourishing. And it refers to the process of choices and life decisions that lead towards something which involves growth, satisfaction, happiness, a lot of things, but not any one of those involved. So personal development is basically the pathway towards eudaimonia, towards understanding oneself, understanding where one fits into the universe, and going on towards improving oneself for the purposes of achieving that. Eudaimonia is interesting because it has the word and the sensation of the term growth bound up inside the term. So it's not just about happiness. It is not just about yourself, for example. It is about something that leads towards growth of the individual, which is what I see personal development as being about.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a beautiful answer. Eudaimonia is a word I haven't heard in a long time, but for sure, flourishing, I think, is such a great way of looking at it. What do you feel are the main challenges in personal development?
Well, one of the biggest difficulties is the impossibility of, well, there are two major problems. One of them is the impossibility of knowing yourself, as well as the impossibility of knowing other people. So in terms of the impossibility of dealing with other people, that's simply due to the issues that language and communication is imperfect. We can never know each other's minds. In terms of understanding ourselves, it should be an easier task, but it's not actually that straightforward. For example, as I'm talking to you right now, I'm absolutely certain that my forehead is not that big, and I'm sure that my clothes don't fit me that bizarrely. And if I were to play back this video, I'd be very certain that that's not my own voice. That's all because the challenge of actually understanding oneself is not a straightforward task. We think we know who we are, but most research identifies that we walk around with a exaggerated and sanitized version of how we actually come across towards other people. The number of studies have found that the average person does not consider themselves to be of average intelligence, and we often assume that we are much better than we should be. And that is human, that is understandable, but it's also a challenge because the idea of personal development is to recognize that you are flawed and to recognize that you have failings and inabilities, which is a difficult thing to do because it interferes with that sense of safety that keeps your functioning where it is. In order to be able to develop, you need to recognize where you have failures and to see these as potentially surmountable tasks.
And do you, I guess going off of that, do you feel that perhaps, is there an end goal in sight to you in personal development? Like, is there something we should be aiming for, or is it just kind of the constant incremental growth?
I believe it's certainly constant incremental growth. And it's an interesting question about what are we supposed to be doing all this for. Ralph Waldo Emerson considered that it was necessary for us to continue to develop, but also felt that we would never reach our potential. So if we can never reach our potential, why should we bother? And the answer is because the goal isn't to reach our potential. The goal is to head towards that. None of us will ever reach our potential, even if we started from birth. But even if you don't get there, heading towards something better than who we are now is still going to be pretty darn good. The old phrase, shoot for the moon and you might land on the roof. There are a number of things that I'm doing now that I did not think were possible beforehand. But as a result of a combination of practices for self-reflection, as well as a significant amount of bloody-mindedness and false confidence, has led me towards this point. But I don't say that lightly. That is also part of the process of personal development, recognizing your own personality flaws and how you come across to other people, even if they may be hurtful, even if they may be painful, is a really important part of maturation, growth, and living a better life.
Absolutely. Here. So I guess kind of focusing it in on our topic for today, which is personality.
Yep.
How do you define personality?
So personality relates to the pattern of how we relate to others and to themselves and to other people and to ourselves. So it's really about communication, interpersonal relatedness. Modern psychiatry tends to include elements of cognition inside there as well, in terms of evaluating what a person's personality is. But most of it is in terms of our emotion-focused patterns of how we respond to ourselves and towards other people. The distinction needs to be made between that and temperament. Temperament is regarded as a fairly consistent pattern of engagement that turns up in early adolescence, late childhood, and is roughly consistent all the way through a person's life, with personality being a slightly more fluctuant feature. There's a flow-on between temperament and personality with a lot of common features. So, for example, introversion versus extroversion, which is a very commonly cited thing. Some authorities think about introversion and extroversion as more likely related to temperament rather than personality. Essentially, it is about how we relate to others.
So your personality can fluctuate depending on the situation you're in, on who you're interacting with. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. Your personality is going to determine how you respond in individual situations, but your personality can fluctuate over your entire life course.
Right.
If I spend a lot of time around extroverted people, they are either going to inspire me or repel me, and my personality traits will develop accordingly. If I take a lot more risks and push myself outside of my comfort zone will change, which will lead towards a change in my overall personality as well. So the things that you do, the people you associate with, these will mold yourself and change the way that you behave. And that's how personality does change over time.
Right. And is there a point of time where your personality is developed, or is it a constant state of flux throughout your life?
So we used to think that it stopped at about age 18. We used to think that, and that's why inside the DSM, all the personality disorders are noted as depending on starting in late adolescence and cemented through early adulthood. There is some neuroscience behind that. We know that the final stage of brain maturation in terms of laying down the higher cortical pathways, Purkinje fibers, that whole phase is roughly about 15 to 25. And we used to think that once you get your personality there, that's about it. Doesn't change, stays the same. We used to think that for not only personality, but for personality disorders as well, which is why personality disorders historically were those conditions that can't be treated. We now know that's not at all true. It's just the brain does continue to change. It just changes really slowly. There's very rapid change in adolescence. It takes roughly about 2 years for your brain to change after that rapid phase of development in adolescence, but it continues throughout lifespan. There is, and this is a very important context, because people believe that as you get older, you lose the ability to learn, you lose the ability to progress. You don't. All the research shows that. What makes you lose the ability to learn and lose the ability to progress is believing you can't progress. The social norms telling you that an old dog can't learn new tricks is a big reason why we have so many older people retiring at 60 and not taking up education courses, not bothering to progress themselves anymore, because they reckon that that's it. So you have a capacity development from the day that you're born through to the day that you die. That never changes.
Right. You mentioned, the difference, the distinction between temperament and personality.
Yep.
And you referenced, extroversion, introversion. What about the things that we colloquially refer to as personality? Where does that fit in? Is that actually considered personality within the study of psychiatry? Is it more temperament? Is it pseudoscience? Like what would you classify it as?
So the things that we talk about generally in general culture, saying that person is so grumpy, that person is so distempered, that person is such a party animal. Those things are likely to be way more accurate than anything the psychiatrists and psychologists can come up with, because those come out of social interpretation of behavior compared to social norms, which means that those tend to be really accurate. So the way that other people view us is far more accurate most of the time than any of these pen and paper tests. That doesn't remove the value of the pen and paper tests. They were designed and have very useful applications in different settings. But what other people think about us is probably the most accurate form to telling what our personality is, as much as we may not like it.
No, that's a really good point. I think that's really enlightening, and that it also lends to what you were talking about earlier, and that sometimes it's very difficult for us to perceive ourselves and who we are, and seeing how other people perceive us can enlighten us a lot better as to either where we need to improve or just kind of teach us more about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So when I at a previous location, when I became clinical director of a hospital, I was provided with an executive coach her role basically was to help me with my career development and working within that particular role. And as part of that, I had to go through something called 360-degree evaluation. So this is a very common thing that happens at the executive level, because conflicts in workplaces happen all the time. They are very commonplace things. Conflicts at an executive level are particularly disastrous for the service as a whole, hence the use of organizational psychology coaches. And the 360-degree assessment, it did include some pen and paper tests, but the most important part of it was an anonymous feedback portal at which my colleagues were all invited to provide anonymous feedback regarding what they thought about me. So that is what is brought in as, and this is a very common practice in management, and it's exquisitely useful because there is nothing more that is going to tell you about who you are than an anonymous perspective from the people around you who are connected with yourself. It gives you a much, much better appraisal of things. And it's a sad thing, I think, that more people don't get an opportunity to be able to engage with it. But it is a wonderful opportunity for change and for personal reflection.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Now, I guess, how does an individual's personality affect their personal development?
That's a hard question. It's because it comes to the problem that a lot of people think about personality in the same way that they think about temperament, that it doesn't change. And the thing is that it does change, just really slowly. So personality development, by definition, is change in your personality. It's learning to be more open, learning to be more conscientious, learning to be less neurotic. All of these things are part of that. If a person has a personality which is in one dimension, it doesn't necessarily need to matter. But there is a subtle difference between personality and philosophy. Philosophy is the way you see the world and the way you think that the world is supposed to operate. If your philosophy is that your personality is who you are, that is, everyone else needs to change, there's nothing wrong with me, then nothing is going to change, for you at least. So personality development is related to personality, but not so much more dependent on your actual philosophy to life.
Right. Yeah, that does explain things a lot better. That definitely aligns with what you've been talking about as well. So I guess talking about personality assessments. First of all, what is a personality assessment? What kinds are available out there?
Okay, so there are more than 150 kinds of personality assessments out there, excluding the 3,000 that are on BuzzFeed. But the idea of the personality assessment is an extension from the Greek ideas of choleric and sanguine through towards Freud's interventions in assessing how a person's personality was through the process of free association. And then it came on towards his former student, Carl Jung, who then talked about the idea that there were particular dimensions in a person's personality that could be actually tracked. Things like intuition, feeling, four major characteristics that were associated with human qualities. which is where one of the most common personality assessments that we have now, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the MBTI, was based on. So it was based on Carl Jung's teachings. Most of these personality inventories are of the same thing. They're a question and answer, several questions which are asked of the individual, and based on their responses from that to determine which personality subtypes that they would fit into. The better ones tend to have something called the lie scale, which is because a big problem that happens with these personality inventories is that they tend to, because we tend to represent ourselves in the best way, we tend to put down things inside there that we worry about how it might look to external purposes. Questions such as, for example, and I've just invalidated most of these tests as a result of telling you this, do you sometimes have thoughts that you wish other people didn't know? Now, the correct answer is yes, because everyone has that. But a person who is a bit worried about what their personality response is going to tick no on that, which comes up positive on a lie scale, which then later on is identified as meaning that the entire exercise is probably not accurate. So they have different tricks like that to try to encourage honesty, try to encourage an honest appraisal about how the person is viewing themselves, and then going into the different subtypes. So we have the MBTI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is another very large, very popular one. Hogan's Personality Inventory, and several others. So most of the research has centered around something called the Big Five, which are 5 personality traits. And these are neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. So these were arisen at factor analysis from several different personality inventories and has been remarkably robust. It has, because the MBTI has 16 personality subtypes, and people have always had this problem about, do we define personality in terms of type or in terms of dimensions? That is, are you an extrovert or are you this percentage extroverted? Hence the difference between a state type or a dimension type. The Big Five is a dimension type analysis, and spits out your personality onto 5 components. Very, very accurate, very consistent, and the challenge with it is that it's quite broad. It doesn't seem to carry too much through towards things like occupational appropriateness, but the value of it is the stability of the readings. Multiple assessments of personality using the Neo 5-factor model have been quite consistent, which is why the Hogan's Personality Inventory was developed. So that was originating from Big Five, but then also through towards looking at occupational appropriateness, such as whether a person would do well in a high stress environment, in a low supervision environment, those sorts of factors. And that's where the Hogan inventory has been so strong. Now, the interesting thing that comes from this is there's always the debate, and it will probably never be assessed, as to, do any of these things actually mean anything? The individual practitioners of all of these personality assessments have extremely good evidence that they can cite about why you should be using theirs. The problem is that all of them are very good at showing the evidence about why they should use theirs and no one else's. So whenever I try to look at the evidence from outside, it's really hard for me to try to tell the difference. I like the ones which talk about occupational exposure. I like the ones which use psychodynamic teachings, because we know that that is historically the most accurate in terms of evaluations of personality. I dislike anything that tells me that this is my personality, this is who I am, and this will not change. That is a big problem, because that's not true. Personality always changes, but the personality test tells you where you are right now. The really big problem is that almost all of these personality tests rely on self-report. So it's what I think. And we've already established at the beginning of this podcast what I think is a very small component of everyone else's. So, which is why when I went through executive coaching myself, I did a pen and paper test, which was interesting. It identified some things about myself that from a bird's eye view was useful in terms of my own planning. But at the end of the day, it was based on my own report. So it was a rephrasing of ideas that I already had.
Right.
which comes actually incidentally back to Freud. You might remember that I talked about Freud's initial statements of personality being based on free association. Now, free association is the practice of sitting down with a therapist, having an open forum where you can talk about absolutely anything. And the beauty of free association is that because the patient can talk about absolutely anything, whatever they talk about tends to be things that are particularly significant to them. And in analyzing why they are talking about particular things, that helps the patient to understand themselves better. So in a roundabout way, even though all of these tests are based on self-report, that's not actually a terrible thing. It's a very similar thing to what may be happening, but in a much more highly structured format towards Freud's whole free association. But it's an incomplete part of the picture. We still need to have the perspective of what other people think about us. So these things will help us in terms of trying to understand what the individual personality assessment is. And they are still very highly contested. At my university, I remember we were contacted by human resources asking us about which personality assessment tools we thought were appropriate to use for screening students when coming into our faculty. And the resounding statement from all of the psychiatrists was, no, they're all crap. None of them mean anything. The resounding statement from all the psychologists was, yes, they're amazing, but there were a huge amount of difference as to which one to actually use.
Right. Of course.
Briefly, all of them are kind of correct. There is value in a self-report personality inventory. There is certainly value in the perspectives of others. Other people are not necessarily right, and I certainly would not trust the opinion of one individual, but I would trust the opinion of several of my peers and non-peers in terms of what they think about who I am as a person, and that together with information that I would be getting from one of these pen and pencil inventories is going to be helpful. I've only talked about personality types, however, not personality disorders, but in the field of personality types, these practices are useful, interesting, and great for personal development. There is the thing that development means that you have it as a thing for reflection and considering what interventions and courses and experiences you want to put yourself through in order to further develop. One of the biggest things about many of these personality assessments is that people use them as a sort of badge of honor. I went through the MBTI and it's identified that I am the highest, I am the ETXR or something, which is the natural born leaders.
Okay.
So,
right, yeah.
which led to this lovely trend of all these, particularly coming out, like the cliches coming out of Harvard resumes, together with the 4-letter code for what my personality is, therefore guaranteeing that you must hire me. So yeah, that's in practice, that's how it ends up being used. It's not supposed to be, and therein is just one part of the controversy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's, I guess, so much there, and that one of my questions was actually going to be about, stuff like tests like the MBTI does kind of sometimes categorize you into 16 types. I mean, I think the most popular website to test for your MBTI is called 16 Personalities, which in itself implies that that's all there is.
Well, the reason why there are 16 personalities is because there are 4 components, and the 4 components are taken out of Jung's ideas. So the 4 components go into a 4x4 grid, which is why you end up with 16. So it's not science, it's math.
It's math, right? Gotcha. How do these personality assessments, where do they become most useful? Where do you see them kind of most beneficial?
I found them most useful in the way that I use them, which is with a coach who helped me with interpreting what they meant and going on towards a longer term plan. So when I was trying to plan out my career at that stage, this identified to me what my goals and interests were, and had me realize that that regardless of the choices I make, there is always going to be some part of me which is disappointed. So you then go towards what parts are core and what parts are not going to be feasible. And also it helped me with thinking that if I'm in this kind of a way, what kind of a person do I want to be? And that's where it was more useful. So you use it as a springboard towards your planning. You do need someone to help you through the process. It doesn't need to be a highly paid organizational psychology coach, but it could be a trusted friend whose perspective you also respect, a mentor, a person who is able to reflect back to you about what it is. I certainly wouldn't do it on its own. I wouldn't have the perspective of this on its own because it requires perfect good planning and a measured and balanced approach to the information that you get from the personality test. Otherwise, what is much more likely is that you'll do the whole test and say, "Oh, how wonderful is that? I'm amazing." There was no point. It's just feeding your ego. It has to be something which is going to lead towards development of yourself and your purpose in terms of the impact that you're going to make towards the rest of the world and why you want to make that impact. And towards understanding yourself. And yourself is not just your personality. It is also your philosophy. It is also your experiences. And there is no end of work out there on personal development. And one of the unfortunate, challenging things is that most of the personal development stuff talks about how can I maximize my achievement in a capitalist society. And the great thing about personality theory and thinking about your personality is that because you think explicitly about how you relate to other people, you come to another dimension of humanity, which is not just about achievement. It is about quality of interpersonal relationships. And the connections that we have with other people, and this is evidence-based, these make much more of an impact to quality of life than the tallest tower that you can build. It is the quality and sustainability of our friendships, our partners, our families. That is what leads towards better, longer-term functioning. But of course, you can't put that on the front of Dimmicks as a bestseller. Spend more time with your family and have a more rounded worldview. That doesn't sell as well.
I feel like if you worded it in an incredibly simplistic way, maybe it could, but I find a nuanced perspective far more interesting personally.
Yeah, because it is about nuance. There is no grand, wonderful, simplistic idea for how we are supposed to live life. It is complicated. It's about understanding ourselves. It's about understanding why we do things. It's about recognizing change. And it's hard to appreciate change in yourself. You only realize that further down the track. And I am much more aware of what an idiot I was 10 years ago, as well as 20 years ago. And I'm sure that in 10 or 20 years' time from now, that me is going to be looking back at who I am and thinking about how ridiculous I was at this stage as well. When it comes back towards literature, and I'm glad that you had that point at the beginning, there is the beautiful play Krapp's Last Tape, Krapp', which talks about an individual towards the end of his life who has made a recording of himself every year and is basically just sitting down and playing them, listening back to who he was. And it's a beautiful statement on personality. It's a statement, he listens to how his own attitudes, perspectives, and sense of self has changed over the decades. And how he himself has changed through to the present time. It's a somber point, but the message of hope that comes out of that is that if we are capable of change, we are capable of change for the better.
Yeah, for sure. That's a beautiful statement, and a beautiful statement to end that section on. I might now move on to our practice/habit experiment debrief. Unfortunately, there's no unawkward way to transition between that and the next part. But I want to now try and put everything that we talked about into some form of practice that the audience can walk away with. So, Professor Jeyasingam, what is a practice that you do to improve yourself, to understand yourself better, to understand your personality better?
In the book Momo, there is a character in the book who is a hairdresser, who has a fairly average life, doesn't do terribly well for himself, but is happy enough and has friends and family and does one thing every day. Every day he sits by his windowsill and thinks back over the day's events for 5 minutes. And this literary character inspired me, and I try to do that every day, just to think back about what all the day's events as an opportunity for reflection and an opportunity for quiet. That practice, I find, has been amazingly helpful because it's about clearing the mind. It is meditative, but it's also about organizing into priority what stressed me out, what I thought was important, and how I felt about the day as a whole. And and doing that as a moment of quiet has been a really helpful practice for myself. The second practice point, however, I would consider to be much more important, and that is morning coffee with my wife. And we have very busy lives, but for 15 minutes every morning, before the kids have woken up and there is no one else around, we sit and have coffee together. And anything gets discussed, anything gets talked about, everything from the day's school pickups through to how I have been going in a particular direction at work, or what my latest project was that I was trying to do and why I was trying to do that. And it's by far the most valuable time of my day because it is about maintaining that relationship and working on that. But it is also with a view towards reflecting back on myself and how I have changed and what my priorities are and what I'm trying to be doing. I think that every person should have two similar daily experiences, an opportunity for quiet at the end of the day to reflect on the day that has gone through, and a meaningful, regular conversation with a trusted person whose opinion you respect regarding the universe, the world, and yourself. So those are the two practices that I have found to be the most beneficial in my regular life, and I hope that you find something similar for yourselves.
Absolutely. You were just saying that you don't think you can make a book out of it, but I feel like you've just got two things there that you can very easily turn into a book.
It's a very short book.
It would be pretty short, but I'm sure we could. I'm sure that would sell better in that case. What are kind of some of the challenges for you when trying to make time for both of these?
That was one of the things that the personality inventory gave me that was helpful. It recognized for me that I have so in my personality assessment, I found that I had a particular creative bent, which is difficult to maintain in academia and in psychiatry. But it was a big part of why, no matter what I was doing, I had an element that I wasn't fully satisfied with. It goes in towards the broader question in terms of what one does with life is probably better explained with things like ikigai, the Japanese concept of organization of life, recognizing that in life you have careers, vocations, hobbies, all sorts of different things for different reasons. And we would like to imagine that our job gives us everything, but our job requires us to be doing something that, well, what we do as human beings is something that we're good at, that is good for society, that you make an income out of, that you are happy doing. And it's really rare that something ticks all four of those boxes. So the benefit of that personality inventory for me was to realize that I am not going to be fully satisfied with everything. So I have to, if there's something that I have to be doing, then I have to work out when and where I'm going to be doing it, as well as recognize that the more that I invest into that, the less I will have for everything else. So it's about prioritizing, recognizing that there are things that I have to let go, but also that there are more practical ways to achieve the things that I want to be doing. So as a result of that, for example, I'm a part-time writer, but I'm primarily a clinical psychiatrist because I much more enjoy the act of talking to and looking after patients compared to everything else that I do. There are many other things that I do enjoy doing. I enjoy teaching, I enjoy education, but that's my highest priority, at least with regards to work. So that's how I sort of organize myself in terms of what I'm doing. It came out of very good support. It also came out of making sure that I had regular opportunities for reflection and introspection.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, how do you feel that this practice has impacted your perception in life?
It's probably reduced my productivity. It's probably I'm probably not making as much money as I could have out of it because it's forced me to have a more rounded perspective to the world. It's made me having to do things like prioritizing the value of my family, the goals and opportunities that I have, my responsibility towards others, my responsibility and interest in myself. It's forced me to sort of realign them better. So I'm not as rich. I am happier.
Yeah. It's like you said, productivity is essentially a capitalistic goal, and capitalistic goals are not necessarily the only path to happiness and self-fulfillment.
It is. It's a useful framework, and
Mhm.
it is a very powerful economic frame. It's a very powerful economic framework, but it doesn't cover everything. There is a lot of
Yeah.
things that we can do that are essential for us as human beings that lead to a better world that do not make us money. Um,
Yeah.
and it's about finding a good balance, realizing that there's always going to be a level of compromise. But the more of these things that you can potentially do, the better life can be.
Absolutely, absolutely. Wonderful answer and a wonderful practice to recommend. So thank you so much. I'm sure the audience is definitely going to get something out of that for sure. I might move on now to our open mic, in which I let you have a mini TED talk
Mhm.
about whatever you feel that you wanted to discuss at this point. So, Professor Jeyasingam, what did you want to talk about during this segment?
So, at the age of 30, I had a serious health issue. The details don't really matter. It's just a possibility that I was potentially about to die. And at the time, I was told that I had a roughly 10% risk of death over the next 5 years. And I remember that my doctor reassured me, telling me that it's only about a 2% risk of death every year. So that's all I had to worry about. I also was thinking about the issue that I probably didn't have to worry about growing old either. Now, the thing is that we don't like to think of death. In fact, there's very good research to explain a big part of that. We are potentially wired to avoid thinking about death. Dawes Ederman and his colleagues back in 2019 did a study where they studied volunteers who were hooked up and looking at screens where a picture of a face would be put up, as well as some image or concept that was related to death, such as the word funeral or burial, and things like that. So after a while, the brain learned to create associations between those concepts, which led towards a change in the electrical impulses that they could detect. And the thing is, they were able to create associations unless the face was their own face. So Dawes Ederman's volunteers were found that whenever their own face was put up, the brain refused to associate it with death. So death, basically, as far as the brain is concerned, is something that happens to other people. So we are possibly wired not to think about death. And this is a problem when it comes to age, because ageism is the phenomenon of discrimination against older people. And there's research from 2014 from Trinity, which found that people who were afraid of death were more likely to discriminate against older people. We call this something called terror management theory, which is that as a means of avoiding anxiety, you avoid anything that is to do with the idea of mortality, including older people. So if you discriminate against older people, you try to avoid anything to do with age, which means that you basically don't have a plan for how you're supposed to grow old. In terms of the question about what an old person is in the first place, you can blame the Germans for this one. So a German chancellor came up with the world's first national pension system, and he initially wanted the age to be 70, but this was refined down towards 65, which is why to this day we tend to think about 65 as being the age of aging. The thing is that he came up with this in 1889 when life expectancy was approximately 39. So since then, everyone thinks about 65 and older as being old. A study with the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2013 found that if you take a group of people under the age of 50 and ask them what old was, they said it was anyone who was 65 and older. You took anyone who was above 50, they wouldn't like to say that. They tended to say things like a person who retires or goes into a nursing home, some sort of socioeconomic milestone that they hadn't yet achieved. So what are we supposed to do as we get older? There was the very first study of social theory of aging was something called disengagement which was proposed in Cumming by 1961. It was the idea that people gradually withdraw from others for the benefit of the individual and society. Everyone hated this idea because it sounded like Cumming was endorsing geriatric depression. Except the problem is that this was based on data from the Kansas City study of adult life. So it's an observational study. It was Havinghurst who came up with the idea of activity theory in 1963 in response to the agitation from this theory of aging, which then led to the idea that for growing older, we need to be as active as possible, which is an aspirational model. It's a nice thing, but it led to lots of promoted studies about people like seniors climbing mountains and winning weightlifting champions and dancing and things like that, which is great, which is amazing achievements. But this was held up that every senior is supposed to be doing, and most people just simply can't do that. This is setting up outliers as being the reason for why we'd be doing things. So aging itself has actually changed. The average life expectancy in Australia in 1951 was 69. Today it's 82. So everyone right now who is over the age of 65 is older than their parents ever was. So they are currently living without a map. They have no idea what they're supposed to be doing, apart from life is supposed to end when you're 65, which is nonsense, which is never the case. Now, this is their issue. The next thing is going to be for us. And it's quite a difficult challenge for the psychologists and sociologists have trouble answering. But there is another study that I'd bring through, which is the Harvard study of aging, because this was looking at, so they studied about 724 individuals over 60 years and tracked them over a very long, and currently the study has expanded to more than 3,000 individuals. They found something consistent. Anything that older people did involving transmitting knowledge to the next generation was associated with happiness. So they use happiness as their benchmark for what you should be doing in aging. And why this is so important is that this is an incontrovertible social role for older people that is associated with mutual satisfaction. It's not about withdrawing and giving up, but it's also not about climbing mountains. It's about very simply having the knowledge you have and transmitting it to the next generation, which is part of why myself and some colleagues founded Wisdom Connect. So Wisdom Connect is a video conferencing-based facility for older people to be able to communicate with each other, but also with the next generation in terms of being able to transfer their knowledge on towards others. We know that late life is a challenge. We know that the older person today has very little clarity about what they're supposed to be doing. But we know that the older person has life experience, and that's absolutely certain. And we know that they're incredibly valuable as a result of that. So the research that I had done had prompted me towards setting up this charity. I'd be very appreciative if you would consider checking out www.wisdom-connect.com to be able to have a look at what we're trying to do. And we also have a panel coming up in the recent Vivid Sydney panel for discussion of this as well. But yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about aging, death, and the meaning of life.
No, absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. We'll make sure to have a link to Wisdom Connect and its website in the description. And for anyone who is in Sydney for Vivid, definitely check that out as well. But thank you, Professor Jeyasingam, for joining us. I really, really appreciated the conversation I've had with you today. I've learned so much from you. Where can people find you?
So my personal website is on coronatorypractice.com. That is, sorry, I'll do that again. So my personal website is coronatorypractice.com.au. That's coronatorypractice.com.au. I have a LinkedIn page as well, and LinkedIn /Niel Jeyasingam. That's NeilJeyasinGam. And I look forward to hearing from yourselves in terms of engaging with my charity or in terms of discussing all things personality.
Absolutely. I'm sure people will be checking you out further after this episode airs. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. I've had an amazing time.
No, not as good as the time as I had. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Aditi.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to Self-Improvement Atlas, the personal science insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. For more episodes like this from 10 different life management perspectives, search LMSL on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, so you can get updated on everything we have to offer. We have a wide range of topics readily available for you to check out. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps us grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can also be found on our website at pe.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Aditi Kutty. Thanks for tuning in.